Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. My name is Nitin Thomas. I work with Shapoorji Pallonji Mid East, and I would like to welcome you all to day two of the annual Value Engineering Summit, the digital event brought to you by Middle East Consultant and Big Project Middle East. This panel discussion that we have right about now will run for the next 45 minutes, following which we will address questions from the audience. Viewers, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat box with your email addresses. So if you're not able to address them during the 15 minutes Q&A session, we can contact you after the discussion. Try and keep the questions as brief as possible. Just to introduce you guys to the panel today, we have with us Charlie Harris. He's the branch director of Omnium International. He leads the Omnium's cost management services in executive QS's role on the Dubai Hills Estate project. He has worked on significant projects throughout his career, including downtown Dubai and those encompassing healthcare, residential, hospitality, and government sector expertise. Thank you so much for joining us today, Charlie. And our second panelist is Rita Allen. She's a senior construction and projects lawyer specializing in large-scale international construction, infrastructure, and engineering projects, including public-private partnership across various sectors, including energy, renewables, petrochemical, water, transportation, healthcare, and education. She has assisted clients with entire tendering process, contract negotiation, and project financing, along with post-completion issues such as variations, refinancing, and disputes. An excellent panel to be with this morning. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us. And as usual, we'll start off with Charlie on his thoughts about what, in his opinion, is a true collaborative approach, followed by Rita.
Good morning, Nitin. Thank you for having me on. It sounds like a little bit of a cliche, but I think the key to any collaborative approach on a construction project is communication, to provide transparency on key issues that projects are facing, and also sharing information to resolve problems together. I think we've all been pushed out of our comfort zone with weathering the COVID season, and I can see that we've been more efficient as a consequence of that.
Yes, definitely. Rita, I would second that. Yes. It's fair to say that COVID-19 really caught the industry off guard. And in that sense, we've had to adapt and change. And in our sector, the clients that have done so successfully have been those that have tried to map a roadmap to work collaboratively and use communication, like Charlie said, as a tool to consider different scenarios and do brainstorming and look at what the potential solutions are so that the project may succeed by that partnership approach. So, for example, in some of our contractual management cases involving the assessment of the impact of force majeure, we've taken into account not only the contract, but also a more wider collaborative approach to look at crisis management. Because the contractual element is one side, but it's also really important not to lose sight of the personal impact that these kind of situations have had. So we're trying to assist the clients with the contractual measures, as well as creating channels of communications that are empathetic to the staff concerns or to the end users' concerns. And for those who have embraced that change, I think there is, as I said, a roadmap to success for the projects, which of course is everybody's aim.
Okay, it's interesting to note that we did bring up two key points, which is obviously we did talk about the communication and we did talk about how the existing process had to be reinvented. Now, Charlie, in your experience or in what you have seen over the last 2 to 3 months, have you seen a different approach towards collaboration, or has it been like it's always been there but never used, or is that something that you would agree with or disagree with?
I'm sure that we've already discussed during this VE Summit the industry's transition to the web-based communication platforms that were alien to me although they were already established, but the Zoom meetings, the team meetings, even WhatsApp groups help project teams come together with employers to strategically address the challenges we've all faced with COVID, sharing of information, sharing of latest government guidelines, looking at sort of, labour movement restrictions and how we can best tackle those together. Also looking at the delays on importation of plant and materials and working together to source local alternatives. So I think for me, the key has been the communication and the communication platforms, and I think it is the new norm. I don't think we'll be using, we'll be going back to the archaic days of face-to-face meetings. It seems like only a few months ago we were having progress meetings and kick-off meetings with 20 plus senior professionals travelling from all around the city, even from other emirates, for a half an hour meeting. I can't see us going back to those archaic days, and I think we all agree that it's a much more effective way of working, utilising these communication platforms.
So Rita, now for your instance, you're more into a more traditional, you're a lawyer, and that's more traditional than most industries that you would deal with. It's used to paperwork, it's used to all hardcore communications, and everything is very traditional. Now, how different has it been for your industry as such, though you are associated with construction, being a more specialized task that you're involved with?
Well, I mean, I think it was an adaptation that was slowly coming about anyway, but it's fair to say that having this pressure to work from home and change the way we work, it's accelerated that change that was slowly being integrated into the contract models. And so we're seeing more use of digitalization. And I really do think that, digitalization and the use of digital platforms will be a game changer for this industry, because when you have an acceptance that there can be paperless methods, for example, for contractual inspections and for the sign-off procedures and so on, that coming up to speed into the digital age will be of real benefit for the contractors as well as the employers. And we're seeing that from a legal perspective, there's more of an emphasis on looking at how innovation can be made integral to the contracts themselves. So as part of a tendering process, for example, to new contractors to demonstrate where they see innovation as part of their business model, and for employers to see how they can perhaps develop and encourage procedures that would foster innovation during the contract live phase, so that we try to see both sides as being adaptive. And of course, digital technology, just by its nature, is very adaptable and very fresh and has that ability to be suited for the particulars of a project. So it's an exciting time to be part of the construction industry.
That's very good to hear. Now, Charlie, I would have to ask you, being a commercial, being a QS, being part of working closely with clients. I mean, for true collaboration to actually happen, the contractual framework should also be accommodating things. Now, we often see in the Middle East there's always a bespoke form of contract, which is often employer friendly, and there's a lack of appreciation towards the lower end of the food chain. That's the contractors and subcontractors. They always tend to be in the let's say they're always with a lesser hand in the contract. So do you think that contracts or there is a need for contracts to be accommodating a more collaborative approach? Would you agree with that?
I would certainly agree that we're all striving as an industry to move towards more collaborative forms of contract. Unfortunately, if I'm being a realist, I'd say at the moment in the current global economy, the triangle of priorities looking between program, quality and cost, I think cost is going to be the number one priority, and therefore Again, I hope that I'm proved wrong, but I think we will probably revert back to the traditional build-only contracts and allow where employers will seek to focus on negotiating the tender award to get the best price, and not necessarily looking at the more collaborative forms of contract where we would engage a higher tier contractor for that early contractor involvement to add value on the buildability and the value engineering during the design development process.
Interesting. Rita, your thoughts?
I guess one of the things that has to be considered in this very cost-conscious environment is also that, of course, there's value in investing in the technology, but we're seeing there's a real need to look carefully at the technology itself to make sure that each of the different elements are talking to each other so that the investment is as efficient as it can be, because, of course, you need to be able to consider how the supply chain would engage with that technology, and is the supply chain in the region that you're working in able to use those digital platforms? Is it something that has a wide adaptation so that it's likely to be of practical use to the projects?
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, see, we did talk about technology. We did talk about bringing people together. We did talk about online communication, but there is an equally dangerous side to that. There is a question of always about data security. There is a question about how good are the systems that various parties are using. I mean, we did mention about Zoom, and then at the beginning of the COVID state, there was a huge safety and security concern that was raised by several parties across various platforms, and then there is so how does that fit in to the framework of ensuring that contracts, projects, information, data, everything associated with the project is secure, and does that have to be something that clients, and in particularly the contractors and consultants and engineers, have to be careful about? So Rita, I'd start off with you.
Yes, I think that is a shift as well, because just in recent times there is more of an emphasis when we're looking at tendering packages and RFPs that are coming to market on demonstrating as a contractor that is bidding for the project that your data mechanisms are going to be secure, that they're meeting a minimum standard, and perhaps a description of what that might be by reference to accepted standards and norms like that are of a universally accredited system. Whereas I don't think that there was that focus previously on data security, but certainly at the moment it's a no-brainer. It has to be addressed, and the employer has to be comfortable that that is being dealt with appropriately. And it's also then something that the contractor needs to invest in or consider appropriately in order to be assessed and win the work, because it's no longer something that is an optional add-in. It's often something that is integral to the decision-making process of who to go for, because we're seeing that these data security issues on the one hand as a risk, but of course digital platforms are a great opportunity for efficiency and the success of a project. If you have mechanisms in which you can use paperless methods of site inspection or sign-off and engineers' approvals in the hope that the project is more streamlined, everybody gains from that. So there's an incentive for people to make it work. But of course, equally, it's relatively new to the industry. You have perhaps different levels of capability across the supply chain. The major EPCs will be able to adapt that, the smallest perhaps not. So there's a lot of considerations, but yes, I think the industry is moving towards that very well.
Charlie, your thoughts, please.
Yes, I echo Rita's opinion. I think security, especially in my field of cost information, is paramount priority, and it's responsibility of all stakeholders to invest in the right software and data protection as we evolve as an industry onto a more tech-based platforms. So it'd be interesting to have this same discussion this time next year to see how stakeholders have invested and what's taken place over the last year, because I can see it's obviously COVID has forced us to move to more IT-based platforms, and I can see that we will have to invest a lot over the coming year. So we'll have that same discussion this time next year, I think.
For sure, and I hope the conversation that we have is very different to what we have right now. That's for sure. Now, I think it's very important to address the elephant in the room. Now, we have, as an industry, we've got various factors, like we've got planning, we've got QS, we've got engineering, we've got site, and all these work very efficiently in silos. And most parties interact where they just need to have that transfer of exchange or transfer of information, and then collaboration between these parties is always something that's very difficult, or it's very culturally challenging in the industry. Now, when you talk about true collaboration, it's just not about making sure that you have a CDE set up, or you have a BIM platform, or you have Zoom meetings. It's more about an openness within the industry itself, which is which reflects a very less adversarial environment, which reflects an openness towards contracts, which reflects an openness in the way cost is managed. Now, do you reckon that this is something that we would see going forward? I know you did mention that contracts may not change, but the behavioral aspect of collaboration, do you reckon that is something that has room for improvement and room for change? Yeah, Rita, you can go ahead.
Yes, I mean, well, ordinarily I would like to be more optimistic, but I think, as Charlie's touched upon, this is a challenging time, so perhaps focus on costs is a more realistic necessity for all concerned. But nevertheless, of course, we do see that there's a need in the industry, because, of course, we have a new FIDIC form that embraces a far more collaborative approach compared to the 1999 forms. And that has been directly reflective of the feedback that the FIDIC Federation has received as to the desire to move to a more collaborative approach. So while we might see a bit of a hiatus on account of the pressure on costs to do with the current COVID scenario, I think overall the contracts are going to shift to a more collaborative model, and indeed with great success. On the Olympics in the UK, a collaborative approach was used to the dealing with claims for variations and disputes, and they, compared with other similar scale projects, they had done extremely well to reduce the amount of time spent in disputes and the costs spent. So there is, I think, different speeds at which that transition is occurring, and perhaps there will be stumbling blocks along the way, but I think the shift in contractual models reflects a desire to move to collaboration. And if collaboration is seen to be effective, there will eventually be a tipping point where it becomes the new norm, instead of, as you pointed to, the existing very adversarial, employer-friendly approach. But these things take time. I don't think it can be adapted with immediate effect. Industry has to embrace it, contractors have to push for it, and the value has to be seen in the contract models that have succeeded using that approach. So it's a three-pronged element.
Charlie, your thoughts, please.
I hope that we do all transition to a more collaborative forms of contract with early contractor engagement, and that we can demonstrate to employers that the saving that could be generated through the contractor's expertise in advice on buildability and value engineering during that development stage far exceed the gains that would be achieved in awarding to the lowest award possible if we went on the traditional build. And that's, as an industry, that's a challenge, is to demonstrate that we can add value, significant value through this early contractor engagement, which would far exceed the current traditional contracts that we have in place at present in this region.
Yeah. So now I must ask Charlie this question. Now, you represent the clients. Your organization does represent a lot of clients, and you are working with multiple contractors. Now, are you seeing an increase in extension of time claims or claims arising out of post-COVID or COVID scenarios? And then, how do you reckon the industry is dealing with that?
Purely from my perspective, we've seen some EOT notifications. However, as I mentioned, we've got a strong employers team here. We have who've collaborated well with the project teams and worked together to resolve the challenges that specifically that COVID have given us. And I must say that of all of the projects we're involved in, every single contractor is now forecasting an increase in productivity as we move out of the more severe lockdown, and materials and goods arrive with more free movement of labour. And each and every contractor is forecasting that we're going to eventually achieve the original time for completion. So, yeah, each EOT will be assessed on a case-by-case basis, but ultimately everyone's working collaboratively for the common goal to achieve the contract programme.
Rita, now I did speak about the claims, but I think it's appropriate to ask about insurances. Now, you know that contracts, how do you think insurance will be going past the COVID season? I mean, are you expecting new provisions to be in place? Or are you expecting to see something different happening with that scenario?
Well, for sure, the insurance market is impacted by the events that we've experienced. And in that sense, I think it will be an area in conjunction with the provisions dealing with force majeure or dealing with what is an excusing event under the contract. Contractors and employers will look at, if the contract doesn't offer you recourse, what about your own insurances for the project? And the idea is that those should dovetail well and one way or another offer adequate recourse to the contractor or to the employer, depending on who bears the risk under the contract. So in that sense, we are certainly asking the insurance advisors to engage earlier on the assessment of perhaps the strategic risks for that project and the way in which those risks can be mitigated. Because as you know, a force majeure claim is typically under a contract one that is unforeseen and unexpected, and that's no longer the case for the issues that we're experiencing now. And similarly, moving forward, I think it's going to be far more of a focus to look at the contractual measures that deal with epidemics and disease and so on, and the different scenarios of treating those risks. I'm not an insurance lawyer, but we do see that there's earlier engagement in the construction industry with the insurance claims process and the ensuring that there's no gaps between the coverage held versus the risks under the projects. And it's worth mentioning too that the insurance industry is obviously now experiencing some shifts and changes too. So if there is a consolidation or a change in the providers and the extent of coverage in the market, that may well have a bearing on the costs associated with obtaining insurance coverage. And those costs need to be, factored into any financial models for a new project or the tendering costs. So it's there, it's very much a consideration.
All right, now that we've brought up the subject of cost, I have to ask this question. Now, COVID has had some financial effect on the industry, both at the employer level and at the contractor level. I mean, at all levels, it has had an impact. Now, the question that I would need both of your thoughts on this. Do you reckon that this has resulted in employers looking at retendering some of the projects, or looking at value engineering some of the existing projects, or even more looking at some sort of a deferment in completion dates to adjust the cash flow and things like that to accommodate this season? I think it's important to put that into perspective, because irrespective of what the situation has. It has had an impact globally on various industries, and that is reflected on ours as well. So, Charlie, I'd start off with you, and then I'll take Rita's opinion after.
We've not seen any projects retendered as a consequence of COVID specifically. However, we have diligently revisited designs to look at ways to value engineering. On certain projects, the employer and the project team have collaboratively come together to look at financing strategies and programs. But as I say, these are all been very proactive and positive conversations and agreements, and have been addressed in a collaborative manner. So from my perspective, I've not seen any projects that have been retendered specifically for COVID.
That's very positive news to hear. And Rita, what about how have the clients been looking at this? Or the employers, the big names in the industry, how have they been reacting to this?
Well, I think there has been some retendering in the last 6 months of certain projects. From an employer's perspective, the reason for doing so is cost certainty, budget planning, and those constraints. They need to have some understanding of the impact of events on likely cost profiles. And I think, whilst retendering has perhaps not the best connotation, at the same time, it allows an opportunity for the discussion to be had. And we've seen that actually as Charlie had mentioned, there's that collaborative approach even with procuring entities to see what is the impact, how can we communicate the changes and look at driving some certainty going forward and ensuring compliance, because of course we want to make sure that the contractors are putting in place whatever the new legal requirements might be to affect, compliance from a health and safety perspective at site or whatever it might be. So there's wider constraints that need to be reflected that are not just a pure retendering based on price, but it might be the provision of additional data and methodology and understanding how is the contractor looking to implement new changes on account of the COVID laws from the regulatory authorities and things. So we've actually seen a lot of dialogue at an early stage to look at the impact of these events.
Interesting. Now, we did talk about a few points regarding procurement, and we also did talk about cost. Now, most of the projects that we see in the Middle East, they are traditionally procured. Do you think going forward we'd be seeing more design and build contracts or public and private partnership form of contracts? And I'm sure, Rita, this is your domain of expertise. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this, and then take Charlie on board.
Yes, I mean, in the water and power sector, you might say that the long-term power purchase agreements or the long-term arrangements are in effect a PPP model in any event because of the nature of that long-term approach and the initial investment costs. But that's now being formalized. We see there's a new PPP law in Qatar that's just been issued, a long time in coming, and there's the Public Investment Fund in Saudi. There's been some successes here in the UAE as well in PPP procurement. So I think there's an appetite to that sharing of risk and costs through a long-term approach. And of course, PPP has successes in the healthcare and education sector in other countries where we can look to as building that success in this region also. So it's an encouraging time.
Mm-hmm. Charlie, your thoughts?
I agree with Rita in terms of the authority infrastructure projects, and obviously taking the more collaborative forms of contracts that they do, it adds to the life cycle cost, and it's very robust in terms of what it delivers. As I mentioned earlier, I hope I'm wrong, but I can't see that employers for other forms of construction are going to embrace the same collaborative approach that may be perceived as paying a premium at the initial stages to engage the higher tier contractors who have the correct expertise to provide that sort of guidance during design and development to add to the buildability and value engineering. I hope I'm wrong, but
Interesting.
we'll see.
That's good to see.
Yes,
I mean, I'm sorry,
it's
please go ahead.
probably
Rita.
better suited to one areas and others.
Okay, interesting. Now, we do have to talk about technology now. BIM is one tool which is being pushed as a collaborative tool, but I'm still keen to see how the various entities or various independent silos that we have within the industry. So the QS, they still rely heavily on traditional methods of measurements. They rely heavily on paperwork, and the planning guys are heavily on Primavera. So you have these tool sets which are for various sectors within the project itself. Now we rarely see these tools talking to each other. Now, what BIM was trying to do was be a part of that conversation with each of these departments and with each of these independent silos. Now, I have to ask you this. I mean, are you seeing such such approaches in your experience so far? I mean, I'm not specifically asking with regards to the Middle East industry. I would probably open this up to a global scale. Charlie, all yours, mate.
Okay. I think we should be moving towards the BIM model, and I'm embarrassed to say that I'm an Excel whiz, and still the majority of the day-to-day tasks that I undertake and my team also is on Excel, which is embarrassing when you compare us to other industries. We're kind of a little bit in the dark ages, and I think regionally we probably do need to improve on that and explore more technology based that we have. And we use a CostX system for measurement, which is fantastic. So I can see that, again, as we strive to become more efficient as a consequence of COVID, we will continue to embrace more technology that's available to us to facilitate that.
Rita, you have any thoughts?
Yes, I mean, I think BIM 360 kind of methodology is the gold standard that we see a lot of value in where it's applied correctly, but at the same time, digitalization and that kind of change does take some time to filter through the industry, and you have to be realistic about how that sits with your supply chain and what your supply chain looks like locally, because there's pros and cons and costs associated with each approach, and in these economically challenging times, it may take somewhat longer than might have been anticipated a few years ago.
So, I can add a point to this. I mean, we have around 11 projects currently on our BIM 360 server, and to be fair, the last 3 months we've had just 3 hours of downtime where we were just shifting PCs so that people could work from home, and then we've had the best productivity over the last couple of months to say that to not literally affect projects the way we thought it would, and that was possibly because of the collaborative approach and having something as applying this technology much earlier than we anticipated. The real need for it would arise, and that's a good sign for the industry as well. Now, in terms of we did talk about the office side of things, but when you go into the post, let's say onto sites, we're still very traditional there. We rarely see things like modular construction or pods, and are you seeing that technology being more adapted, considering that we would like to have a lesser footprint within construction sites to increase, and also it would be more safer and much more efficient from engineering through to installation? Do you reckon that that's also a possibility that would happen? Rita and Alan, Charlie, I'll leave you guys to this.
I think it's probably more one for the industry expert, Charlie.
We've certainly seen great success in prefabrication and hot construction, and I can certainly see that contractors and employers alike will be looking at these technologies that are available to us and looking to utilise them more in the future. We can certainly do a huge amount more, but with COVID and the restrictions it's given us in terms of logistics, in terms of welfare of operatives, this can all be streamlined and improved significantly through the use of prefabrication that we have available to us. We have in this region as well. We have all of this fantastic technology available to us, and I think we've been, as a region, we tend to sort of run at 100 miles an hour. But I hope that this COVID season has made us take a step back and look at what's available to us to support us for situations like the COVID restrictions that have been imposed of us over the last few months.
Yeah, Rita, you could continue, please.
Yes, I mean, I think these modular approaches and different efficiencies, it's not always going to be suitable for all sectors and all areas of construction industry. But what Charlie said is actually encouraging, and hopefully if we have this conversation in 24 months' time or something, we might see more adaptations in the market.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Just a reminder to the audiences that are listening to us today, please feel free to share your questions with your email addresses across the platform so that we can address them in the next 5 to 6 minutes, and then we'd be able to have a very, very good question and answer session. Now, I think I'll just put this in a very as simple as, yes, please, Charlie, go ahead.
Sorry, Nitin, I was just going to make another point. I've seen over the last 5 to 10 years that the industry has moved towards locally sourcing plant materials, as opposed to when I first arrived here 12, 13 years ago. There was always a brand specified with the source of origin. And again, I think this is an important point, because I think we can still do more to focus on the local supply chain, which is relevant in terms of COVID because of the restrictions we've had on importations. But it is also more cost effective, and it's also more beneficial for the local economy. So whilst we have made strides over the last 10 years in terms of the local supply chain, I still think we can do more. So I think there'll be a big focus on that over the coming months as well.
That's very interesting.
As a related,
yes,
related to that, we see also in the tendering process that there is attention given to local content, and that forms part of the scoring mechanisms. So it's incentivizing the contractors to also look to that and focus on it in order to get the highest score in the bid assessments and win the tenders. So it's an industry focus and an employer focus.
Okay. I must, I think this is a more of a personal opinion that I'm looking for. In your opinion, how do you define true collaboration? So I'll start off with Rita, I'll take with Charlie, and I'll give my final thoughts, and then we'll have one more question.
So I like the BIM analogy of a 360 model for a contracting approach as well, because the outlook changing from a more assertive, aggressive, employer-friendly contracting approach towards a early assessment of the usefulness of collaboration, then the true collaborative model would be one that looks to encourage collaboration and innovative approaches to communication or contract strategy in the tendering process and rewarding it in the bid evaluation process rather than focusing on lowest price outcomes. Then during the contract negotiation and execution stage, you might say, well, collaboration, what does that look like? It looks like listening to and taking on board suggestions from both sides as to how a contract might be adapted and improved to gain successes for the contract execution, rather than an inflexible no markup approach. And then during the delivery of the contract, you might say that mechanisms and procedures in place that encourage early dialogue to avoid disputes and to avoid bottlenecks in the supply chain, flexibility, that kind of thing, without penalizing where it's unnecessary. If the ultimate schedule or the ultimate cost is not impacted, looking at a way that supports the contractor in a collaborative model, then if these steps are part of that 360 approach of collaborating in partnership with the contractor, hopefully the experience will be a positive one and the contract would be delivered perhaps more successfully than using the traditional model.
Interesting. And Charlie, your thoughts?
As we touched on the pre-contract, assuming we did have a more collaborative form of contract, the key for me would be to appoint a careful pre-qualification of the correct contractor with the appropriate expertise in in-house design teams or relationship with reputable design consultants. So it's about collaboration. Also, another strong point is the relationships. Fostering long-term relationships. If there's been a successful project previously that is being repeated or is similar in nature, trying to retain the same key individuals for those projects to continue with the strong collaboration that was had. And then just from a post-contract perspective, the key is communication and transparency on all project issues and working collaboratively to resolve them, working towards a common goal.
Interesting. Now, I totally agree with whatever both of you have been sharing with regards to true collaboration. I think it's more of a trust, and it's more of building partnerships, and it's more of bringing the industry. Though we're talking about them for the last so many years, still the implementation is very rarely done right. It becomes just an engineering process, and then it just stays there. It doesn't move on to integration with the other silos within the operations, and that's something that the industry probably will mature itself across the period of time. And I don't think there's running away from it. It will eventually catch up, and that's how the industry has got to be. Now, I have coming to us, just one last thought. Now, we've had a few months of working from home, remote collaboration, cloud sharing. Do you reckon that this could be a new norm for our industry that is very traditionally rooted? Or do you think that we'll still go back to being the old workhorses that we've always been? So I'll start off with Charlie and then final thoughts from Rita.
I think that during the initial lockdown period, there was an initial culture of presentism where there were colleagues that were sending excessive emails and not utilising the platforms we have. But it's like riding a bike, I suppose. It's all become second nature to us, and we've actually found that looking specifically at the day-to-day services of a post-contract QS, processing of payments and variations, there's actually been an increase in productivity during the period in which we were working from home. And I assume that's due to more effective meetings on these platforms and not having the same interruptions that you may have when you're working in a busy site environment. From my personal perspective, and I think working from home has been very positive. I would certainly support, particularly for certain issues, and particularly for colleagues that are working in a head office that on a sort of a more specific task. Working from home has been fantastic, and I'm a true advocate of the working from home culture.
All right, brilliant. It's very interesting to know that. And Rita, how has it been for you, and what do you reckon would be the future going forward?
I think we probably won't see the going back to normal of 5 days a week in the office, 100% of the staff body anymore. And it's not necessary either. I also echo what Charlie said, you know, there's been a lot of adaptations because we've been forced to do so. And the speed at which we've adapted our business model to deal with the online environment has been really fantastic. You know, I've enjoyed working from home as well. By the same token, I think there's something that is lost, you know, the water cooler moments, the unanticipated changes where an opportunity might be discussed and the firing of ideas in a meeting room with other people. You don't get that if you're in a Zoom call, I'm afraid. So, and similarly in a legal environment, you know, we have to encourage young talent and support our junior lawyers. And it's very difficult to do that mentoring and supportive teaching in a digital manner. It's much more preferable to do so in person. So I think the way we work will likely change, but I would like to see a mix of home and office environment.
Sounds nice. Now, coming towards, we're going to be taking questions in the next few minutes. So I'll just ask, do you have any closing thoughts, Rita, before we get on with the questions?
No, I just wanted to say how pleased I was to see so many virtual discussions like this that really get us thinking about a change in the way we collaborate and a change in which we use technology to our advantage. It's the new normal, as you've said, and we welcome the change, and it's been great talking about this with you too.
Charlie, closing thoughts?
Thank you for the opportunity for the discussion. As Rita's just mentioned, I've really enjoyed discussing collaboration, which is particularly poignant given the last few months of challenges we've all faced. But I do think that as an industry, and specifically as a region, we have, as a consequence of the challenges that we faced, we certainly have improved dramatically in terms of our efficiency and our communication. And I think we will look back on this as a positive. I feel very positive moving forward.
All right, we've got the first question coming in, and we've got some interesting poll questions that you guys are going to be really finding tough to answer. So the first question is, will linking supply chain incentives with the success of a project encourage a fully integrated and committed project team? So Charlie, do you want to take this one?
Yes, I mean, certainly I think this is more appropriate to the collaborative forms of contract that we discussed and lining up the supply chain incentives. But certainly that collaborative approach through the food chain is what we all strive to achieve, and everyone working collaboratively to achieve the cost efficiencies that are required for the employer. So yes, I think it will. Yes.
I believe this should be driven with some sort of the incentives is great, but I mean, how do you measure those incentives? That would also be something that will have to be addressed when you look at providing an incentive to the supply chain. Rita?
Yes, I mean, we see these supply chain incentives already in a lot of the large-scale construction contracts that I'm looking at. So in terms of the measurements, for example, in a schools project, you might have key performance indicators that are built into the contract operational model that say, well, how many classrooms are available at any one time? There's financial deductions from your monthly payments if too many classrooms are unavailable for poor maintenance or whatever it might be. So these supply chain incentives are built into the contract models from the outset, and similarly in the hospital or transportation industry. And of course, it's likely passed down the food chain to the subcontractors as well to similarly incentivize them.
Another interesting question that's coming is, will applying more cost reduction increase the chances of spending more of the budget in future to apply desired changes? It's interesting to look at that perspective. Rita, do you have anything to add on this?
Well, ultimately, that's less of a driven by lawyers approach. It's really where the contractor and the employer can develop the mechanisms in the contract to consider where cost reductions or cost increases have to be developed. And we do see that in some of our contracts, for example, there is a mechanism whereby if there are savings, these must be passed on, or if there are cost increases, they're to be shared. So there's usually a contractual procedure that drives the conversations of the parties.
So, Charlie, I'm sure you're better placed to answer this question because obviously you would be seeing kind of scenarios often.
The question alludes to potential late instructed changes during the post-contract, and I think hopefully as cost is given real focus, that will enable us to properly develop a robust tender design or contract design, or if it is a design and build contract, to clearly define employers' requirements and a project brief that would avoid those changes, so that we have time to properly develop the designs and in line with the contract budgets, and would minimise any future post-contract variations that would cause any potential delays and claim situations. So that the ideal is that as we focus on cost with the current global economy in its position we're in, that we focus less on fast-tracking procurement and instead focus on getting the design right in the first instance.
Brilliant. Now, we did talk about EOT claims and EOTN claims. There's another question on that. So post-COVID, will EOT claims be judged on a case-by-case basis, or is it going to be one case which takes the as a let's say as a benchmark for all the other cases to follow? I think Charlie, and then I'll take Rita. Oh, sorry, Rita, please.
I was just going to say, the lawyer in the room says all of the extension of time claims should be judged on a case-by-case basis, because that's what the procedures in the contract do.
Okay, brilliant. Charlie, I think you would second that, yeah?
Certainly, yes.
Interesting.
Exactly my point.
So, and okay, this is very interesting. Now, how can digitization be filtered down through the supply chain so as to increase transparency at all levels? I think this is very interesting, and I probably will take a first dig at this question. It's more about understanding that capability of the supply chain, because you can't expect at all levels of supply chain to have the same set of digitization and same set of technological skill sets. You would not expect the same from a subcontractor. So it's really about understanding till what level you want the maturity to be at, and this should then further reflect based on the competency of the subcontractors that come in. And I believe these would be driven by the cost of what's allowed on the project, and how the employer evaluates each of these subcontractors, and how each of the supply chain members are evaluated. And I believe that will eventually drive digitization down the supply chain. So you would probably end up looking at a very cost efficient partner in the supply chain who may not be as technology driven as another party who might be a little more cost inefficient. I mean, what do you guys think?
I think it's a really interesting point. I think it's a really interesting point, and it may encourage the supply chain to also invest in technology to ensure that they're on an even keel with their competitors. So no, it's interesting, and I think we'll see as we keep discussing this, cost takes a real focus, and we've come out of the COVID season. I can see that subcontractors down the food chain will have to evolve accordingly.
Interesting. Rita, this question, I think this is more of a very construction-oriented question. So, one-stop shop construction firms with who are both main contractors and MEP contractors and ID contractors, and do you think those would remove the need for specialist firms? I mean, do you agree with that, Charlie, and then Rita, please?
It's dependent on the particular construction. I think it's a good question. It's dependent on the particular contractor and what expertise they have available in-house. As I say, it ultimately comes down to the individual company that we're discussing and what expertise they have and what experience they have. So I don't think you can be generic and say that a one-stop shop contractor would be ideal for all projects. It needs to be looked at based on the individual contractor and what expertise they have available to them.
Okay, Rita, your thoughts,
yes,
please.
I would agree. I think certainly there is the opportunity now and the need for consolidation in the industry. There will be firms further down the supply chain that are under pressure, and that might be taken over or subsumed into larger organizations. But still, I'm sure there are particular sectors within the industry where that specialized knowledge is such that they remain unique and need to sit in that space within the market and are not of interest to one of the larger EPC or conglomerate organizations. So I think there's a space for both.
Okay, this is interesting. I'm sure, Rita, you could answer this one. With PPP on the rise, should there be government incentives to encourage collaboration and transparency?
I think a PPP model in itself offers incentives because it does encourage that view towards a long-term approach. Where there is a PPP model, of course, you look to the long-term life cycle and operating costs rather than the initial costs of construction and handing it over, because you are running it as a contractor for the next 15 or 20 years. So right from the beginning, that model encourages innovation and encourages cost-saving measures and looking at the lifetime cost of the approach.
Interesting. Charlie, your thoughts?
I share the same view as Rita. I think she answered it very well.
All right, this is interesting. You did mention this a few times, Charlie, in your conversation today. Due to COVID-19, local available alternatives are playing a major role in procurement. Is this an impact on the cost and time claims? A very different perspective to what I thought would be the question.
One would argue that to mitigate cost and time impact on a project, we're seeking locally available alternatives. And as I say, this has not just been since COVID has been an issue, but I've seen over the last 5 to 10 years, we're less and less seeing that air handling units that are on 6-month lead times from the US, or distribution boards being transported in from Germany, and we have this all available to us in the local market, which is more cost effective, logistically provides benefits in terms of delivery times, and as I mentioned earlier, it's beneficial for the local economy. So I'm all for seeking local alternatives.
You know what? Here's the last question before we close today morning session. I have to really think about 100. This is a very interesting poll. So 100% of our viewers today think that construction contracts should be amended to take into account new rules and regulations driven by COVID-19. I would love to hear your honest interpretation and not your own interpretation rather. So that we could just conclude this discussion today.
Sure, I'll go first.
I think Okay.
Go ahead.
Well,
No,
we
Rita,
managed
you
to
go.
not do this session. All right, Rita, you
My apologies, Rita. You go first.
yeah.
I was just going to say, hopefully the contract has been drafted in such a way that it already envisages changes in law, in which case the change in law provisions of the contract would adequately address the changes needed in terms of the delivery approach or the procedures and so on to reflect what needs to happen on account of the new law. Because typically if you have a relatively broadly framed change in law provision, then the contractor is protected in relation to the impact of that change. So assuming the contract is one of those models that has already considered change in law, then perhaps the change is not necessary. However, if you're looking at new contracts being entered into, then absolutely they will be amended to take into account, and we're seeing that already across the board. Or discussions for those that are on negotiation at the moment. It's very much a hot topic. We're having a number of changes to expand upon the consequences that the contractors are seeing and to deal with that in a contractual way. So yes, I definitely think that a construction contract in the future is always going to have a lot more emphasis on the kind of issues that the market is seeing and dealing with right now.
Brilliant. Charlie, closing thoughts, please.
I agree with Rita. I mean, I'm not aware of any existing construction contracts that have been amended specifically to accommodate COVID, but they all have the local authority provisions included in those. But I do think moving forward, new tenders, certainly contractors will want a specific reference for how we fairly and reasonably share the risk of future pandemics and ensure that there's transparency on the liabilities moving forward. So I certainly think that's something that as an industry we'll be sort of feeling our way out and how we address this and incorporate it into future construction agreements.
All right. That kind of was a great session, and I hope very sincerely that this is the last of the pandemics we see in our lifetime, at least. And as usual, I have to say thank you so much to our fellow panelists, and of course our wonderful audiences for listening in and for those wonderful questions. So that's it for the session today. The next session, the second session for today, will be at 12 p.m. If you've registered, please check your email inboxes for a link to watch the Arabi Software's 10-minute 5D cost estimation demonstration. All the QSs in the house, please do tune in. And once again, thank you so much for the organizers for putting together such a good online summit. And thank you, Jason. Thank you, Gavin. Brilliantly organized. Thank you so much. Thanks to Rita, and thank you, Charlie, for joining us this morning. Have a nice day ahead.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.